Opportunity. It's a great honor to speak here with all of you, a lot of people here who have been basically dedicated your entire life to the struggle of Tibet, to the cause. And there's no words to tell you how much we appreciate everything you have done and yet to do for the Tibetan cause. I would like to just go into three segments for organizing the way I want to approach this, and I want to start with some bad news, and then share some good news, and then go into what's next, or what should be next. And the bad news is, I think we have heard already enough about the bad news, which is, as Professor Levrat said, the liberal international world order is collapsing, basically. And unfortunately for human rights movements, this is a very difficult time. And especially for Tibetans, we developed many of our strategies and advocacy approaches in the 80s and also in the 90s when the liberal order was at a peak and human rights was universal. Countries, even though they did not practice it, they paid lip service to it. And now we live in a very different world without rule of law, but much more the law of the jungle. And so that's a difficult time for us. At the same time, China is also changing a great deal, and even by the standards of its own heinous record, China under Xi Jinping has become much more repressive, much more hardline, and also more sophisticated in its propaganda and strategies. So we are dealing with those two things at the same time. And we have seen, many of us have seen the way the CCP now pushes its narrative on Tibet. It has become much more effective, much more sophisticated, and everything that it's putting out on social media, especially on TikTok, they are really educating the next generation of young people in the West and in the free world. They are getting their education through Chinese algorithms, so they are learning everything wrong about Tibet and Tibetan history right now. So for us, we have this uphill task. And of course, Chinese government has also made clear its intentions to eliminate the Tibetan people as a group, along with the Uyghurs as a group. And they have come up with this new method of genocide without massacre, in a sense. Because for many people, when they hear the word genocide, they immediately think of the Holocaust and assume that it has to look like that. But that's different standards for the 21st century elimination or ethnocide. And right now, this is the direction we are heading in. So we should believe what the Chinese government has said with the new law, ethnic unity law, but at the same time, there is some good news. And the good news, I would argue, is that the environment, an environment that is bad for human rights promotion, may be interesting for other types of struggles. For peoples and nations that are engaged in self-determination struggles, this chaotic, anarchic kind of environment may be interesting. I'm not saying good, right? May be interesting because it's a time of uncertainty. And uncertainty comes with opportunities. So our struggles, many of us, they might actually become worse. But at the same time, if we seize the right opportunities at the right time when the window appears, it could also bring us to the shore of nations who actually made it there. And there was a very interesting paper by the scholar Seva Ganitsky, and it's about hegemonic transitions. It's about geopolitical shocks. If you look at the history of the last 100 years, what are the windows when the vast majority of the nations that are in the United Nations today gained their freedom, we'll notice it didn't happen kind of steadily or consistently, one at a time, two at a time. It usually, when it happens, it follows a shock to the international order or a regional system. And when that geopolitical shock comes, it creates a wave of change. And this change could be change for worse, change for the better. It depends on how you take advantage of that. And we'll notice, in the era of the post-war, post-Second World War time, between 45 and 65, many nations actually achieved their dream and became decolonized at that time, right? It didn't happen for years, hundreds of years, and then suddenly it happened in 10 years, right, for many of them. Then in 1989, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that created another geopolitical shock to the system, and many other new countries were able to emerge out of that. So these are some of the possibilities, I would say. And now, right now, I think the stage is kind of set for a more aggressive approach to our advocacy. And especially, I want to mention His Holiness's book that came out last year. And in that book, he makes it very clear that this is the time for a strategic reset for the Tibet movement. We have been misled by the Chinese government. We approached the struggle with full, clean, good intention. We did everything from the Tibetan side to compromise, to negotiate, to dialogue, everything. We gave away, we conceded our position on so many issues, and still the Chinese government, instead of responding to us positively, they have betrayed every attempt. And I think for us, it's actually, it opens up the avenues for the type of strategies we could use. And Sikyong Pembala recently has been very actively promoting Michael's book. I think that also talks about a strategic reset, and Dr. Lau's book, which talks about the historical independence of Tibet as a nation state. So I think those are changes that are actually very positive for the Tibet movement, because it allows us to reimagine the struggle and repoliticize the struggle and re-strengthen it in ways that can be different from many of the constraints that have kept us down in the last 30 years under the past international order. And here's, I want to go into some suggestions. These are not solutions, but I would call them suggestions. And I'm sure some of the suggestions are already being implemented by many of our supporting allied governments and also our own Tibetan government in exile. So this could be kind of a wish list. I think number one tool that we should explore using more, as former Special Coordinator Azra said, I think sanctions. There is a lot of potential in sanctions, and on issue by issue, identifying the right issue to push. The colonial residential schools, that is an issue that's actually very dangerous to us, right? It's very dangerous to Tibetan culture and language, but at the same time, it's very sensitive for China. And the Chinese government really hates it when anyone brings up that issue, because that's their Achilles heel. They don't want to be seen as colonial, right? They think of themselves as an anti-colonial country, right? So calling them the colonial residential boarding schools, and using that as one issue where we can explore sanctions. Hypothetical actions also. Sometimes direct sanctions are difficult to push for because they seem unrealistic or very difficult for countries to do. But we could get commitments on hypothetical actions. If China does this, then will you do that? If then type of sanctions. If the Chinese government installs its own fake Dalai Lama, then the Swiss government should recognize the Tibetan government in exile. Connecting those two different scenarios, I think those would be one way to normalize some of these ideas that right now may seem difficult. Also speaking out loud, saying things very often and publicly, whether they seem to make a difference or not, because the difference will not be seen until much later, because we are in the long game. Self-determination is a long game, and we won't know until much later, so we should at least we know that not saying it will have a direct impact, negative impact, right? And also using a combination of rewards and penalties. We often use penalties sometimes, but rewards can also be very good. And whenever someone like the Nepalese government says no to receiving the fake pension from China, what can we do to reward Nepal for that particular action? Because sometimes we sanction them and we condemn them for repatriating Tibetans back to PRC, right? So whenever somebody does something positive, how can we reward them? We can come up with a regime of like rewards and punishments for those type of actions. If somebody uses the word Xizang, Bhutan did recently, you know, and Nepal Prime Minister also did. When somebody uses that word Xizang instead of Tibet, what can we do? What kind of punishments are we going to impose? What kind of sanctions are we going to impose? And sanctions should not only target governments or states or companies. We can also target individuals, scholars, journalists, individuals who use these terminology. They should be subject to similar type, you know, of sanctions. And recognizing the CTA as the representative of 6 million Tibetans, I mean 7 million, I think we are 7 million by now. Tibetans have been busy. And you know, the Chinese government, the Chinese population, they're having real demographic challenges, right? They're demographic collapse in China right now. But Tibetans, I think if democracy is the predictor of future, there is hope for Tibetans. Create a multilateral contact group for supporting a long-term resolution that restores Tibetan people's ability to determine their own future. And it should be consistent. This group of increasing numbers of states should meet consistently to coordinate actions together so that China cannot single out and punish each of the countries individually. So there is safety in numbers and collective action. Publicly oppose China's interference in the succession process of Tibetan Buddhists, especially that of His Holiness. And you know, saying these things publicly right now, putting them out in as many literature as possible, all of these things will make a really huge difference down the line. And using language and rhetoric, using the power of language and rhetoric, sometimes our governments out here do not have the enough influence or enough power to change China's behavior, right? But we do have enough power and freedom to change the way we talk, language, rhetoric, and counter Beijing's attempt to shift the norms, basically. They're trying to shift the norms on everything. And let's not normalize the idea that in the future there will be 2 Dalai Lamas. That is not true. There will only be 1 Dalai Lama, all right? And whenever the media talks about 2 Dalai Lamas, whenever a scholar or a policymaker says in the future 2 Dalai Lamas, no, we should correct them. There will only be 1 Dalai Lama, and that will be the Dalai Lama born in exile, right? Legitimized, approved in exile by the exiled government, basically in Dharamsala or outside of PRC-controlled territories. And whoever the Chinese government installs in Beijing, we just should not call that person by the same name. They should, if anything, we could call them anti-Dalai Lama, right? During the time, there was anti-popes, claimants who were, you know, who were against the Pope or rival candidates. You know, just because you claim that you are the Pope, you don't become the Pope. You have to emerge through the system. Just because somebody claims I'm the president of the US, I don't become the president, right? So people should not entertain these claims by saying there is 2 presidents of the US or 3, right? And stigmatize. There should be a list of terms that we delegitimize and stigmatize, and there should be a list of terms that we normalize and legitimize. And of course, you know, talking about situations or sometimes stepping back a little bit and looking forward in the future and talking about a vision of post-CCP China. What does a post-CCP China look like? Because everybody's talking about post-Dalai Lama situation, right? But we have to think very seriously about a post-CCP China. And when or if that happens, what are governments willing to do? What are they not going to do? And the PRC, as we know it right now, is a project of the CCP. The PRC is not a country. It's a project, a colonial project of the CCP. So we should start pushing and normalizing the idea that if the CCP collapses, the PRC should be gone too. Nobody should extend recognition to the PRC. And China might emerge out of that, just like Russia emerged out of the Soviet Union collapse, right? China could emerge and exercise. The Chinese people get their own self-determination. Tibetans get their own self-determination. Uyghurs, same thing. Mongolians, right? And one thing we could also, what I would like to see governments and others do is also provide or support the Tibetan government and provide and support the civil society organizations in the Tibet movement in a much more aggressive and much more ambitious way. And especially, if a certain government goes to China, or a prime minister or whoever from a country goes to China, fails to raise the Tibet issue or fails to speak strongly on certain issues, then there should be a tax on them. After you come back, send more funds to Dharamsala. Like we have the carbon tax, right, to offset your carbon footprint. So we should have a cowardice tax on these governments. If you show cowardice and if you didn't raise the Tibet issue strongly, there should be that cowardice tax, so you send more money to Dharamsala. And finally, finally, I would like to also provide some suggestions and recommendations for Dharamsala, for our Tibetan government in exile. Especially, I want to take advantage of the fact that our Honorable Sikong is right here with us. I think with full recognition that even though we are an exile government, an exile polity, and an exile community of refugees, we actually do have a lot of power. A great deal of legitimacy. We have way more legitimacy than the Chinese government. And people often talk about asymmetry, right? There is a power asymmetry between China and Tibet. But actually, when it comes to other things like soft power, there is an asymmetry on our favor, in our side. We have much more soft power than they do. We have much more legitimacy. The organization of the Tibetan government, democratically elected, plus His Holiness's institution, they have much more legitimacy than Xi Jinping or CCP, and we should use those power in order to mobilize more advocacy on behalf of Tibet issue. And many of us were very encouraged when we recently heard statements from Sikong, especially in DC, on the idea that if the Chinese government fails to show any positive response to His Holiness's conciliatory approach of the middle way and dialogue and negotiate, if they don't respond, then within a given timeline, countries should support or recognize Tibet's right to independence, or recognize Tibet's historical right to independence. Right? So those are, I think it's a very, very powerful statement, and I think that is the kind of direction where it sets the Tibet movement up for much more, exercising much more power vis-a-vis China. And we could create, some kind of a ladder of escalation, that includes things like, okay, coming up with deadlines and dates where, like, if Beijing does not do this by September 2026, then we are going to retract some of our past proposals, some of our past olive branches. So something like the genuine memorandum for genuine autonomy in 2008, right? Or 2009, something like that. We could say, well, if you don't do this, we're going to retract that statement so that the table is empty for new imagination. Make Tibet a bigger problem. Right? Sometimes we're trying to be so careful. We don't want to cause problems because we are too Buddhist. We don't want to cause problems. We don't want to cause inconvenience. But now, actually, we could adopt a more secular approach and try to be the biggest problem in the room so that we get the attention and the solution. And even though we may not win on every single issue, we could be the spoiler. It doesn't take that much power to spoil things for the Chinese government or its relations with other countries. We could, we have a lot of spoiling capability. We also have power to produce instability, in Tibet as well as in China. And the Chinese government knows that. They know that. But until now, we have never our own government has never activated or actively used this power, right? But it is there. Finally, in terms of narrative control and discourse, I think we should also adopt a bit more active presence in left-leaning spaces so that we can replenish the ranks of our movement with the new generation, new blood. Because, the Tibet movement, the old generation is getting old. I mean, look at all of us in the room. You all look very young. You all look very young. But we need new people. We need new activists, we need new recruits, we need new policymakers, we need new members of Congress who are supporters of the Tibet issue. And we have, of course, in a country like the US, we have some amazing champions in the previous generation. But, look at Nancy Pelosi, an incredible supporter of Tibet, right? But where's the new generation? So in the future, I would love to see Si Kyung and other representatives of Tibetan government when they stop by in New York, get a meeting with AOC, and finally, language. We need a language police on social media because social media is one place where we are really losing the battle. We have been losing the battle to China. They are so effective, they are so skillful, they are so smooth, and they have the numbers, right? And I know many of our own people are on Facebook, but I think Twitter is the more interesting place where battles happen, debates happen, and you can hold people accountable on Twitter publicly, and they respond. Even like, high-profile individuals who have really huge power to set opinion makers, right? They are so vulnerable, they are so sensitive if you send them a message on Twitter. And I think, Tibetan government could actually start a kind of an army of, social media police force, army who are just watching who's doing what, and put everybody in, keep people in line, keep people in line, keep governments in line, keep policymakers in line, and if they do anything funny, they should lose, there should be some kind of punishment, and especially, last one thing, a little bit of internal policing would be very helpful also. This is for the Tibetan community ourselves. And our DC representative, Tenzin Namgyal Churupla, made a very powerful suggestion on this, right? And I think there should be, if an individual works with the Chinese government, is collaborating with the Chinese government, there should be a consequence. It cannot be without consequence, free for all. There should be a consequence, and we can come up with a list of increasing punishments for bad behavior. You do this thing and collaborate or support the Chinese government's argument, well, you will lose clearance. In Dharamsala, no more jega for his with His Holiness. Like we can come up with some kind of like a progressive list of actions that we can take. So that would be helpful to keep the movement together, raise morale overall, because when some people break the line and break the norm, it could lead to some kind of disintegration in the future. And we really need this kind of consolidated, non-fragmented movement that can wield all the power it has. So I want to leave with this one line by Rebecca Solnit, I would say. She says, in dark times, there is hope because there is uncertainty. And right now, it's a scary time for all of us, many people, but I think because of the uncertainty, there is hope. And hope is not like a belief system or, based on data or optimism, but I think she argues hope basically lives in the places where we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And that is a beautiful thing because we can take action. And our action can change reality. So I would encourage everybody to read that book, Hope in the Dark. And if anybody is interested in Tibet Action's report, this is the second report on the colonial boarding schools. I have a few copies and we also have PDF. Thank you so much.